Video killed the radio star. Video killed the radio star. Pictures came and broke your heart. That song by the British group The Buggles was the first music video ever played on MTV when that channel signed on the air at 12:01 a.m. on August 1st, 1981. And it suggested that local commercial radio was in serious trouble now that music videos could be seen on television. Well, it wasn't quite true at that time, but local commercial radio is in a lot of trouble now. It's becoming a lot less popular and a lot less people are listening. Radio was the first electronic mass media. The radio era began in the fall of 1920 in Pennsylvania when station KDKA signed on the air. And one of the first things that people heard were results of the victory in the presidential election of Warren G. Harding over Cox. And so that began radio news. For a long time, radio was what you call the theater of the mind. The programming that people heard there consisted of dramas, comedies, variety shows, a lot of things that would later appear on television. One of the first stirring music on radio was the WSM Barn Dance on WSM 650 in Nashville, Tennessee. And that soon became known as the Grand Ole Opry, a live music show every Saturday night on WSM, and that is still heard today and going into their 93rd year, I believe. But for a long time it was the theater of the mind. Now the young recording industry didn't really like the idea of free music floating around all over the place in the beginning. However, they soon realized that radio was the best promotional opportunity that they could possibly have come up with, and so recording artists began to record these albums, and they would release one or two of the songs from that album as singles that were played on the radio, and those songs served to promote the albums, and so music became a big deal. With the advent of television, the theater line began to go away, and radio became more of a music jukebox. Now, in those early days, there was more of an expectation that radio stations should operate in the public interest. The Communications Act of 1934 created the Federal Communications Commission to regulate radio, which originally had been regulated by the Department of Commerce, I believe. And it was required of stations that they operate in the public interest. So in addition to becoming essentially jukeboxes, radio stations began to cover local news. They created their own local news departments, and much like television stations do today, the radio news departments would go out and collect local news, then write, edit, and report local news on the air. And that became a really big deal in some markets. Some stations would hire 2, 3, 4, even 5 dedicated news people to gather and report local news on the radio. Some of the best examples of music programming and how that ought to be hosted came along in the form of countdown shows. There was American Top 40 with the great Casey Kasem. And that started because in his local radio show, Casey Kasem would get information from industry magazines, and he would synthesize that and present that on the air to complement the playing of the music, and that was fantastic. American Top 40 had a huge audience for a long time. It also happened in country radio with a show called American Country Countdown, which I believe was hosted by Ralph Emery. And if you want two examples of the gold standard of what music programming ought to be, those would be some good examples. You don't have a lot of that anymore, but one current example is Eddie Stubbs, who is nighttime announcer on WSM in Nashville, Tennessee, which is of course heard all over the world now, not only on 650, which is heard in 38 states and parts of Canada, but all over the world through the WSM app. But those great national shows weren't really replicated at the local level. What developed at the local level was you see, the two key times in local radio are what they call morning drive and afternoon drive, when people are commuting to and from work and going various places. And that runs roughly from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. in most places, and maybe 3 to 7 p.m. in a lot of other places. And so that's when the audience was the highest, and the advertisers who pay for the programming want to concentrate their commercials traditionally they have in those time periods. But what developed with the music programming was stupid morning shows. It got to the point, and it became standard, that for morning shows, and sometimes even for the afternoon drive show, instead of getting a lot of music, you got a lot of stupid, inane talk, boring actually, from local personalities. And instead of playing the good music, what you got was yakety yakety yak, talkety talkety talk, and yet people still listened because entertainment options were fairly limited for a long time. For a long time, the basic entertainment options you had were radio, television, cinema, live performances, concerts, and also stage performances, and that was basically it as far as live entertainment went. And so the options were limited, and so these stupid radio shows that you had in the morning became the thing that people listened to. A lot of people like that stuff. I personally can't stand it. I do not like the utter stupidity that you hear in morning shows. I would much rather hear some good music to de-stress, especially when I was in more stressful environments than I am today. And yet that was the thing that people listened to. Now, unfortunately, that got pretty big, and a current example that I really can't stand is a show called The Rick and Bubba Show, which originates, I believe, in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's these two guys, they call themselves Fat Boys or something like that, and they spend 4 hours just talking about stupid stuff, and that grew beyond their local market, which was originally small town Alabama, and I think it now covers a number of southern states, and just utter stupidity. I don't know why people want to listen to that stuff. The head honcho of that, Rick Burgess, was actually listed as one of the most influential people in Alabama a few years ago. And the way he's the most influential person in Alabama, one of the most influential, is saying stupid stuff on the radio for 4 hours every morning. And yet, that is what people listened to for a long time because entertainment options were limited. Well, stations began to back away from local news. They began to cut out news departments and eliminate them entirely. There was still a facade of local news, and that they would steal stories from local newspapers, television stations, and a few other sources, just ready-made, just edit a little bit and read it, and that was the extent of their news coverage. But they began to back away from local news in a big way, and that was the beginning of losing the local identity. Well, that didn't hurt them for a long time because, as I said previously, entertainment options were limited, and so people still listened to that stuff. But and one other thing, the fairness doctrine that used to require balanced points of view, that used to be a rule that the FCC had, and that kind of went away. And then you saw the rise of conservative talk radio, and that became really, really popular. If you ever listen to conservative talk radio, it's just different versions of the same thing. Low taxes and limited government. If that doesn't work, more taxes and more limited government. If that doesn't work, you do it even more. And you listen to one conservative talk show, and you've heard them all, basically, because they say the same thing over and over and over again. And so huge companies began to acquire radio stations all over the United States. There was Clear Channel and a few others, and you had conservative talk radio everywhere, and that's what people listened to. Well, of course, that appeals to a certain segment of the population, but you're not going to get everybody beyond that. You're not going to go very far beyond your base. Well, with the decline of local news, radio stations started to lose their local identity, and you had stupid morning shows, and then you could hear some music programming in the middle of the day, and then stupid afternoon shows, and then more music programming at night. But the local identity with the decline of local news started to go away. Well, they got by with that for a long time, but then the internet came along, and then apps came along, and then streaming came along, and now there are legions of entertainment options out there. people don't have to listen to their local radio stations anymore. They don't have to listen to the local yokels saying this stupid stuff anymore. They don't have to be frustrated by all this talk because there are entertainment options galore. On cable TV, you can get music channels, free music channels, which are just non-stop music. And if you want to listen, for example, to good country radio, if you're a country fan, you can go to the app on your phone, just listen to WSM, which is the capital of country music, and you get not only modern country, but classic country, bluegrass, gospel, and so forth. If you want to hear an announcer who is more similar in certain ways to Casey Kasem and Ralph Emery, you can just listen to Eddie Stubbs from 7 to 12 Central. You can listen to any radio station in the world. Now, considering that radio has largely lost its local identity, these other options are pretty good options. You can get non-stop music on cable television. You can get better hosts by listening to just about any radio station in the world. There's really no need for a local option anymore because you can get better stuff over the internet. And so now radio is in serious trouble. Now, what could they do about this? Well, the end of local radio news, which hasn't ended completely, but it's not really a big deal anymore, that the stations stopped serving their communities the way they used to. There's still exceptions. In disasters, sometimes you can still get lots of good local information on radio. One example was WQSB in Albertville, Alabama, in the April 27, 2011 tornado disaster. And I was in Alabama at the time, and they did an excellent job. But generally speaking, there's not that local identity that local radio used to have through their local news. The local identity concerns promotional stuff with sponsors, generally speaking. And so radio has lost its local identity, and people are able to get better entertainment options minus all this talk simply by using streaming services and listening to any station in the country and many stations all over the world through their apps. And so what does all that mean? That means people have started to walk away from terrestrial local radio. I went over a month recently without listening to a local station because why would I? I can get better stuff over the internet. I can get better stuff streaming. I can get better stuff, with apps. Listen to any radio station I want to anywhere over the apps on a phone. And so there's really no need for local radio if they're not going to have a local identity. What could they do about this? Two big things. They could go to strong local music format, one that would fit the market that they're in, and focus on the music. And another thing they could do would be to go back to local news. And that would mean hiring some people to work in local news departments so people could find out what the hell was going on in their local areas without necessarily burying their nose in the El Paso Times or watching 30 minutes of local news on television. 5-minute local news summaries at the top of the hour, maybe international summaries from a network at the bottom of the hour, or reverse that, and combine that with strong music format, and radio could make a comeback. So far, they are not willing to do that. They want to continue, it seemed, to have stupid morning shows cluttered with talk instead of music, and sometimes the same time in the afternoon. And then the music that exists on local radio, you can hear it anywhere because it's everywhere. It's the same everywhere, and the reason for that is to make a lot of money. The artists have to have a huge national audience. That's the way they make a lot of money. So terrestrial radio is in big trouble because there are just too many other options for entertainment. There are all kinds of options that didn't exist before. And so people don't really need the local stations without a local identity. So what could happen in local radio that could bring it back? Those two things. A strong local music format with a strong focus on the music and a lot less talk, and bringing back local news. Hiring news people to actually gather and report local news in short summary format, say 5 minutes at the top of most hours, and that, I believe, would actually bring back local radio. Because if they don't do something like that, if they don't have more of a local identity, if they don't provide needed information to people in that local area, they're irrelevant, because you can find entertainment anywhere, and you can find it better through streaming services and on the internet. So that is my take on what's wrong with local radio and what they could do to fix it. strong music format, focus on the music, and getting back into local news so that they have a local connection, and that, I believe, would bring back local radio in a big way.